Hello,
Hello.
Dr. Friedman.
Let me adjust my sound level. Loud. Right. So what would you like to talk about?
So we are working for a libertarian movement in India. So we had a lot of questions from, friends and people from movement. And I have been reading a quite of lot of work from your side, your books, articles and stuff. Found them very interesting because they are more nuanced than the other works that I have read from libertarian authors. So for guys who don't know who Dr. Friedman, Professor Friedman is, he's a legal theorist, he's an economist, and I think he has a PhD in physics also. And he has been writing for more than like decades in various uh, domains of, let's say, libertarian works. So we will
My
be,
first book would have been published a little more than 50 years ago.
that's like 5 decades.
Uh-huh. A little more
So,
than that.
so your book has been there before even most of us were born.
Uh, I don't know who most of us are. It was not before I was born. I assume it was before you were born.
Yeah. By the way, have you ever been to India?
Yes,
And
twice. I was there a very long time ago and visited the Taj Mahal, as everybody does. And I was there with my daughter giving some talks, I suppose about 10 years ago. And part of what impressed me about India was that it felt a whole lot like a capitalist society as imagined by a Russian communist who had never been outside of the Soviet Union. And in the sense that there were very large numbers of very poor people, and then the property in the most expensive part of Delhi was one of the most one of the most expensive places per acre in the world. Uh, I spoke at a sort of I guess, a business school, something like that, in roughly central India. I forget the name of the city. It was a fairly prominent city, and it was surrounded by a high concrete wall with barbed wire on it. And inside that wall, it was just beautiful. It was trees and grass and no crowding. Outside the wall was not so beautiful. Uh, and yet it was a society that had, at that point, been controlled by people who considered themselves socialists for essentially its entire history. That is, entire history of the country. Obviously, the society is much older. And that I thought was interesting. There were obviously huge numbers of talented, hardworking people there. Uh, and I had various ideas of why they were not richer, but certainly I'm not an expert on India. But it was very interesting.
that's great. We will be welcoming back anytime you wanna come
Uh-huh.
back in India. I would like to ask, what are the top three books that had the most profound impact on the way you think?
Huh. That's an interesting question. One of them, I think, would have to be Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics. He was the person who, more nearly than anybody else, put together modern economics at the end of the 19th century. Other than that, there's a science fiction novel by Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which had an effect on me because it started me thinking about certain questions that prior to reading that, my basic view was that most things were best handled on the market, but that a market required a framework, a legal system produced outside the market. And that seemed sort of intuitively obvious. And what Heinlein's novel did was to give a believable picture of a society in which the legal system itself was endogenous, was coming out of the interaction of people rather than by legislature, government, king, or anything of that sort. And as far as I could tell, it was a consistent picture. And it was not a picture of my society. Uh, on the other hand, if it was really impossible to have a market society without a government framework, then it should be impossible in all times and places. That, as I like to put it, a theorem is refuted by a single counterexample. And therefore, I concluded that it might be possible to have something analogous in something more like my society. And that really started the thoughts that produced my first book, Machinery or Freedom, part of which, although nothing like all of which, is a sketch of what a stateless society in something like modern day America might look like. Uh, Long after that, I read about a whole bunch of legal systems, mostly historical ones, that produced a book of mine called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And it became clear that there had indeed been real world societies of this general sort, much less division of labor, much less organized than what I had imagined, but at least as organized as what Heinlein imagined, maybe more so. Uh, and I have a chapter in that book in which I discuss the logic of what I call feud societies or feud law, which is a class of legal systems in which law enforcement is private and decentralized. Uh, and that interested me. So I think Heinlein and uh, Marshall are probably the two. There are various points of economics where I think I am more Marshallian than most Marshallian economists, in the sense that there are ways in which I think Marshall got it right, and later economists to pretend to tried to avoid some hard problems which Marshall recognized existed. And therefore, I prefer to go back and do the original version. Uh, but other than that, another book that very much impressed me was Ricardo's Principles of Economics, which was written about roughly a century, a little less than a century earlier, maybe 80 years or 90 years before Marshall. Uh, and that's impressive partly because Ricardo does things that are obviously impossible. That is to say, he basically works out a version of what a modern economist would call general equilibrium theory. And I think he was the first person who really did a competent job of that. And he does it with none of the mathematics that a modern economist would tell you was required to do it. The way I like to describe it is it's a little bit as if you were part of the first Mount Everest expedition. And as you came close to the peak, you were passed by a hiker in t-shirt and tennis shoes on his way down. That's sort of the feeling that I think a modern economist can have reading Ricardo. And Ricardo has lots of neat things. For example, I've been saying recently that Ricardo has a discussion of the AI problem. Uh, and he's not putting it in terms of AI, but in his book, he says that it had been his opinion that the accumulation of capital could never make workers worse off, that essentially would mean more demand for their services. But he had now realized that one could imagine cases in which technological improvement did make workers worse off because it made capital a better substitute for labor. That's not his language, but that's what his example of capital in that case is horses, uh, which were capital goods from his standpoint. So it isn't our artificial intelligence, but a lot of the worry about artificial intelligence about artificial intelligence at the moment is that if computers become a good substitute for human thinking, then what will humans have to do? So in that sense, Ricardo, writing about 1820 or so, saw the problem. And there are other examples. The There's a something called Stigler's law, which is that scientific theories are never named after their real inventor. And I should say it was not invented by Stigler, as he will tell you. This is Stephen Stigler, who is the son of the famous economist George Stigler. Uh, and Stephen is a statistician, a fairly prominent one. And one of one of my examples is that what Ricardo is perhaps most famous for is Ricardian rent, which he makes clear he did not invent. Some of his friends invented it. He used it in his work, but he didn't invent it. On the other hand, one of the things that Marshall is famous for is what's called Marshallian quasi rent, and that's in Ricardo. Uh, so anyway, two examples of Stigler's law that I am fond of. Uh, anyway, so that's a book that impressed me, but I wouldn't say it changed my thinking very much because Ricardo is doing what's in a sense a very primitive version of general equilibrium theory. It's just that he's doing it with none of the necessary tools, and he gets in his version. He basically starts out by making a simplifying assumption. He has an estimate of by how much that simplifying assumption will distort his results, how much relative prices will be off as a result of it not being true. And he then uses that simplifying assumption to make the problem he's looking at solvable. So it's quite a neat, quite an impressive piece of work. Uh, but as I say, uh, but I can't think, I'm really not sure I've got a third book that is, I guess the third writing, which ultimately has a large effect on my views as an economist, is work by Ronald Coase, but it wasn't in the form of a book. It was basically in the form of two articles. One of them, his article on the theory of the firm, and the other his article on problem of social cost. And uh, that certainly has had a large effect on me. Posner's book on the economics of law has had a substantial effect on me, but largely by my wanting to point out the places where it's wrong. That I was at University of Chicago Law School for, I don't know, eight or 9 years, which was where Posner was. And I taught a law and econ class using his book and made lots of notes. And the next time he revised the book, I sent him, I remember it as my notes being about a tenth as long as his book, which is probably an exaggeration, but it was a lot of things on things that I'd gotten wrong, I thought he'd gotten wrong. And I then wrote my book, Law's Order, in which I tried to get, but his book was certainly very important. That is, he got us thinking about a lot of interesting things. But I think he did not always get them right. And I should say, Posner, to his credit, wrote a very nice blurb for my book. So on the back cover.
So to get into a bit of detail regarding what you said about course, uh, regarding the article of social cost, there was another Chicago economist, Harold Dempsey, who had written a counter of it. What do you think about that?
I thought that Demset's line I remembered was that he should have gotten the Nobel Prize instead of Coase because he had written many more articles about Coase's ideas than Coase had. But the ideas were basically Coase's. No, there are several people. Demsetz is one of them who've done a lot of stuff with Coase. As you may know, Coase's final book was on China. It was a book co-authored with a Chinese economist on how China went capitalist. And I was asked to do a review of it for a journal, which I did. And in the course of that, I reread more or less all of Coase's stuff. And I concluded that I had really not correctly interpreted the. I wrote a piece explaining the relevance of Coase's ideas for the law, basically, at a point when Coase was a colleague. And his comment to me was that you never really understand your ideas until somebody else explains them to you. And I suspected that he had his tongue firmly in his cheek, that he was being very gently sarcastic. And I understood that after I reread all his stuff, because what I was doing was saying given the relevance of transaction costs to all of these issues, if you knew enough about transaction costs, about what the transaction costs were of various possible transactions, you could figure out what the law should be. And I spent a chapter or two in my book, Law's Order, which were really based on the article I had written, saying how would you decide among alternative versions of liability law given Coase's ideas? And that I think that's a correct statement, except that I think from Coase's standpoint, what he was really producing was a reductio ad absurdum of modern economics. That is, his point was that the standard economics that all of us do implicitly assumes zero transaction costs. It assumes that markets always clear. Uh, in fact, I would have said that really the right way of thinking about the distinction between what's called microeconomics and what's called macroeconomics is not that one of them is big and one of them is small, that the world wheat market is a problem in microeconomics. That what I think is the cleanest definition is that microeconomics is the economics of equilibrium and macroeconomics is the economics of disequilibrium. And we understand the economics of equilibrium very well. Marshall understood it pretty well. We don't really understand the economics of disequilibrium. Uh, that I'm not a good authority on that because I've never really gotten involved in macro. But my usual line is that a class in macro is a tour of either a graveyard or a construction site. That we don't have I don't think we have a clearly written and reasoned out theory of macro in the sense in which we have had more or less ever since Marshall a pretty clear theory of price theory, which I think is the right term for micro, not micro. Uh, but but anyway, uh, I think what Coase was saying is here are these problems that your conventional theory says exists. If there were no transaction costs, those problems would disappear. That's the Coase theorem, basically. That, but that means that there are really problems with transaction costs, and we don't have a decent theory of transaction costs. So I think his view was that what economists ought to be doing was looking at real markets, doing theory, figuring out the things we didn't know about why organizing things one way or another works better. And from his standpoint, I think part of the interest of the Chinese experience was that they were reinventing capitalism. That the Russians and the Eastern Europeans basically imported American economists to tell them how to do it. The Chinese didn't. That what happened in China was that after Mao died, the top people in the Chinese Communist Party were able to go abroad. And they went abroad and they discovered that their country, which had what they sincerely believed was the world's best economic system, was also one of the poorest countries in the world. So they concluded they were doing something wrong. Perfectly reasonable conclusion. I think, vice chairman or something of the Communist Party visited England. And he came and he observed that an English trash collector, I think, had twice his income. And he concluded that England would be the perfect the perfect socialist state, the perfect communist state if it only was run by a communist party. And so they said, we don't know what to. But the other thing, which I think was important, I don't remember if Coase discusses this or not, is that one of the economies they looked at was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia thought it was socialist, but Yugoslavia was organized in a very different way from the Soviet Union. That Yugoslavia could be described, almost could be described, it could be described as a capitalist society in which all the firms were workers' co-ops. And you couldn't set up, I don't think, a standard investor-owned firm. But then the things we call capitalist economies like the US are really very imperfectly capitalist economies. There are lots of restrictions on it. And, the government collects whatever is 30 or 40% of national income, more than that in European countries. So, in a sense, Yugoslavia was a different imperfectly capitalist society. But from the Chinese standpoint, it was a different way of doing socialism and one that seemed to work better than their way. So that suggested that there could be lots of different forms of socialism, and they should try to figure out what worked. And at least the person more nearly in charge uh, concluded basically that we didn't know what changes should be done, and therefore should let things happen and not suppress them and watch. So in two very poor villages in China, in different parts of China, the people in effect reinvented private property and land. That they reorganized things so that each household had a piece of land that was theirs. They owed a certain fraction of their output to the group, to the commune or village or whatever they called it, but the rest was theirs. And in one, if I remember Kosa's story correctly, in one of them, it was the local communist officials who were hiding this from their superiors, and their farmers themselves who were hiding it from the local officials. But either way, in both of them, it worked. Both of them were very poor villages and became much less poor. Eventually, it came out, and the official government saw it, and they said, well, you're not allowed to do this, but we're not going to punish you. In fact, we're going to let you keep doing it. And we're going to let other villages that are doing really badly under our present system, they can do it too. And then after a while, they observed that it worked and they let everybody do it. Uh, and there were a couple of other things where by Kosa's account, uh, basically things were happening that were either forbidden or were not part of the plan. But Deng let them happen, and the ones that worked, they kept. So as you may know, one of the things that they did was they said, look, clearly the capitalists know something we don't. Let's try to learn it. How do we learn it? Well, suppose we had little capitalist enclaves inside China, and we could watch what they did and then steal their ideas and use them in socialism. And Xiamen, I guess, which was one of the first ones, was a poor fishing village, and it's now a city of several million people. Uh, and these worked well enough so that eventually the exception swallowed the rule. The basic idea was you did it in places you didn't care about, so if it was a catastrophe, it wouldn't matter very much, and it wasn't a catastrophe. And the result is that China is also now a capitalist country. They don't say they're a capitalist country, and they're not as capitalist as they ought to be, from my standpoint, but neither is the U.S. So anyway, it was, but I think from Kosa's standpoint, part of the point was that because they were reinventing it, they were doing things in different ways, and thus giving us more data, more evidence on how things can be organized. Uh, anyway, that was a very interesting book, but it's not. I
I think
read
that,
that maybe
there is
eight
a
or 10 years
chapter.
ago.
I think
What?
there is a chapter in your book regarding this creeping capitalism or something like that. I don't
Yes,
know the name, but it
yes,
goes talking about these things that
mm,
we could arrange society in such a way, and it came before China did all these things, I guess. So you kind of
yes.
predicted it.
Well, maybe, but they demonstrated it. Uh,
Okay. To get back to our next question, um,
sure.
what are some of the unsolved problems we libertarians would be better off spending our time on?
It's a good question. Uh, the the first step in the answer is to realize that the answer will be different for different people. That uh, one of the things one observes in political movements is they spend a lot of time fighting with themselves. And part of the reason is that if you say, well, this is a really important political, this is an issue that the future depends on. And I figured out what you should do, and you're not doing it. That's terrible. You're wasting our resources. And that's a mistake libertarians shouldn't make. You're not my resource. I'm not your resource. That different people have different talents. And one of the problems that we have to solve is spreading the more nearly correct ideas. That it would be very nice if people in most countries thought of tariffs as a way of shooting yourself in the foot rather than a way of benefiting your country. And tariffs happen to be a case where more or less all economists agree about the basic logic of it, and nobody else does. That that there is a incorrect model of tariffs, which is easy to understand and makes much more sense than the correct model, but if you think about it more carefully, is internally incoherent. Absolute advantage, basically. Uh, and that's one case where uh, if people, I like to say that the political system is sort of like a microscope with a fine control and a coarse control. And the fine control is basically lobbying, uh, political interest groups. But the coarse control is free information. The coarse control is the things that everybody knows. So therefore, you have to act as if they were true if you don't want to get elected. And if if 98% of the American populace understood tariffs, Trump would have found it politically catastrophic to do the stuff he's been doing, but they don't. And this is going to be true with a lot of other issues. It's true of minimum wage law and so forth. Uh, so one of the jobs is to spread the ideas. And that was one of the things that my father did very successfully. My standard example of, I think, my best effort along those lines is something I've written about the fact that there are two ways of producing automobiles in America. You can build them in Detroit or you can grow them in Iowa. And the way everybody knows how you build automobiles in Detroit. The way you grow automobiles in Iowa is you grow the raw material they're made out of, which is called wheat. You load it in a ship, you send the ship into the Pacific, and it comes back with Hondas on it. And it's not a perfect explanation of comparative advantage, but it is a close to correct explanation, which is easy to understand, and which then tells you that when you put up a tariff, it tells you that these are both ways of using American resources to produce cars for Americans. They're alternative technologies. And what you're doing with a tariff is saying, I'm going to tax one technology and not the other, with the result that even if growing Hondas is cheaper than building them, you'll still build them, which makes you poorer. And that's so I like that because it's an idea I invented. It turned out that somebody else invented it first, but he did it in the form of a much longer and more entertaining story, and nobody repeated it as far as I know, or almost nobody. Somebody, I think, I think my friend Steve Landsberg may be the one who told me about it, but it was in a book somewhere well before I'd come up with it. And uh, but that's my contribution, as it were, to spreading the truth on that particular subject, is thinking of a way of encapsulating it in something that a story people will like, and it gets repeated quite a lot by Steve among other people, uh, and
So
the
the gist is
but
proper
there are
plan.
other things that have to be done. So if what you are is not if what you are is a novelist, you can write a novel which embeds your ideas. So Ayn Rand was a very influential figure. She was not a university professor. She didn't teach courses. Well, she taught courses in her own invented things, but nonetheless, she affected a lot of people by her fiction. Uh, Similarly, uh, if you're an academic, you can try to spread the right ideas through that. Uh, if you're an entrepreneur, well, one of the reasons people believe that government you have to have a government is because certain things they only observe being done by governments. So if you're an entrepreneur and you can successfully produce schools that cost a third as much as the government schools and do a better job, people will be less willing to believe they need government schools. And I gather India is a case where you actually have versions of that happening. Uh, and similarly, I think that if you had said 40 years ago, how about we abolish the post office in the US? The obviously crazy idea, we wouldn't have any mail. Nowadays, the only reason that the post office delivers first class mail is because it's illegal for UPS and FedEx to deliver first class mail. But everybody knows that if you want to send packages, you can use the post office, you can use FedEx, you can use UPS. There are probably one or two others. So one of the things you can do is to create a company which successfully competes. Uh, One of the things that Musk did was to demonstrate that the government runs space much worse than he does. Uh, and uh, and doing that, I think, makes people less willing. I actually, as you may remember, in machinery, I have the idea that you could have done the space program as a private enterprise, but Musk's doing it, uh, and so I guess the answer is there are a bunch of things to be done, and what's the thing a particular libertarian should be doing depends on him. It might be teaching high school. It might be getting bright young kids uh, and getting them the right ideas. It might be writing high school textbooks. Uh, I mean, there are a whole bunch of things where different human talents and different tastes. If I say to you, the only thing to be done is being an economist and spreading free market ideas in economics, and that's not what you're going to do, what you want to do, you're not going to do anything. Whereas if I list 15 different things you could do, and one of them is something that appeals to you, then that's going to work. So I think the idea that there is a correct libertarian strategy or tactic is a mistake.
That is such a nice answer. Moving forward to our next question. Um, a lot of people don't understand property rights and why they matter. How would you go about making them understand something that they find as a legal abstraction?
Uh, I guess one way is to think about it in a relatively simple model where the property is all stuff that individuals have built with their own hands using free resources. Think of a big forest that anybody can go in and cut down trees and build things. And you then think about if you don't have property rights, then as soon as one person makes something, someone else steals it, and then people won't make anything and they'll all starve to death. Uh, and similarly, you need private property and land because otherwise the farmer plants his corn and weeds it and raises it, and lo and behold, just about when it's ripe, somebody else harvests it. Uh, I like to put it in terms of long-term planning that one of the claims that critics of capitalism make is that companies only do things in the short term. And they've got that exactly backwards. That I'm 80 years old. Suppose black walnuts are really pretty trees. They make very nice lumber, but they grow rather slowly. And suppose it takes 40 years for black walnuts to grow. Clearly, it would not make any sense for me to plant black walnuts. But of course, it was. It's true that by the time they are ready to be harvested, I'll be dead. But I can sell my field of black walnut trees 10 years from now to somebody who will only have to wait 30 years because they've already gotten going for 10 years. And he, if he wants, can sell them in another 20 years to somebody else. So it pays me to make plans whose payoff is beyond my own lifetime. All right. And this is in general true that through the mechanism of private property and trade, people have an incentive to plan for the long term. However, that incentive depends on secure property rights. If if we know that each year of the 40 years, there is some chance that an enterprising private person will drive onto the field and cut down the half-grown trees in order to use them as lumber. Not as good as when they're fully grown, but it's been very cheap for him because somebody else did all the work. Or if we believe that any year in those 40 years, the government might decide that black walnut trees are a national resource and nationalize them, then it will not pay you to make the long-term investment. Well, if you think about ordinary capitalist society, property rights are pretty secure. So it pays to make long-term planning. On the other hand, if you think about the political system and you think about it not as an imaginary benevolent dictator sort of over everything, but as itself a market, as a place where individuals are pursuing their own self-interest, but under a different set of rules. Well, the property rights to political assets are not very secure. If you're the governor of a city in Chile and you have a choice between spending money on fixing the water system, which everybody knows is going to break down sometime in the next 20 or 30 years, or spending the money on providing desirable things to your voters, uh, well, probably by the time the water system breaks down, you're not going to be governor anymore. So it makes sense. In general, the way I used to put it, it was really no longer relevant, was that Clinton could rent out the White House, but he couldn't sell it. That politicians have insecure property rights in their political power. Because if you're president now, Trump is not going to be president 10 years from now, probably a good deal sooner than that. And therefore, it doesn't make sense for him to spend political assets to do things that could get him votes for his people in ways that'll have a payoff in the distant future. But it would pay an entrepreneur to do that, assuming the payoff is high. Now, politicians are very good at claiming to have a long-term perspective. But the reason for that is the nice thing about the future is you can't see it. So if somebody says, yes, it's true, we're spending a lot of money on such and such, and it's true you don't see any output, any result, but that's all right. 15 years from now, it's going to be just wonderful. Just have to wait. And my leading example of that would, of course, be Joseph Stalin, that he couldn't convince the people in Moscow who were living a family to a room, basically, that they were well off. But he could, for a while, convince a lot of them that these were the sacrifices they were making, so their children and grandchildren would be richer than the Americans. And it didn't happen. Eventually, people stopped believing it, but he could do it for a while. And similarly, I expect that Trump is engaged in the same game in modern forms, in that he says, well, yes, the tariffs may have some problems at the moment, but they're making America great again. So I think in general, if you think about long-term planning, about concerns for the future, it is, I think, obvious that secure property rights are a critical institution to have that happen.
Going a bit detail into the thing that you mentioned, that politicians have low time preference. So there is Hans Hermann
They don't.
Hoppe.
They at individuals as individuals they don't have low time preference. It's just in their interest to. That is to say, if if I look, I can be a person who very much values the future. But if I know that anything I build today is going to get stolen tomorrow, I'm going to build things that I can consume today. Well, politicians are the same way. That politicians talk about the long term, but you notice that what they're really interested in is what's the inflation rate going to be at the next election? What's the unemployment rate going to be at the next election?
So Hans Hermann Hoppe makes a point that, monarchy is better than democracy because the rulers have a better incentive for, let's say,
I understand, but there are a number of problems with that. Uh, I would certainly agree that there's no guarantee that democracy will work out well. One problem, again, goes to secure property rights. That if you actually look at historical monarchies, most of them you have not quite a civil war every time a king dies, but it comes close. That when Henry I died, that resulted in a 15-year civil war uh, between his nephew, Stephen, and his daughter, Matilda, both claiming the crown. Uh, when John died, there was a French army in London supporting the barons who were rebelling against John because he'd done a very bad job of being a king in a variety of ways. Uh, when Richard, if I just go back to the English history that I happen to know, Richard is off in crusade. He gets, in effect, kidnapped on his way home, and his brother John promptly starts trying to seize the throne. And there's a civil war there, which more or less John loses and Richard gets back. Uh, so it's not clear that we have a good way of actually getting a stable, secure property right for kings. Uh, Beyond that, the king has an obvious incentive to benefit himself at the expense of other people. On the whole, I think I prefer feudalism to monarchy. Uh, that if you're going to go to historical systems, that I think of feudalism as basically a system where the critical resource is widely distributed. The critical resource in the Middle Ages was heavy cavalry, knights, and the equivalent. And therefore, the ruler has to be a coalition leader, which is what happened to John, basically. Uh, and and I think if you read about the political machines in the U.S. at the sort of the end of the 19th and early 20th century, that they're feudal too. The critical resource there is votes. And the ability to control votes is widely distributed. It's basically the local, precinct leader who's the guy who made sure that when somebody's house is burned down, the occupants got taken care of, and he got jobs for people, and he did various favors, and therefore they'll vote for him. There's a wonderful book, uh, Plunkett of Tammany Hall. Plunkett was a high level, not quite top level official in the political machine that ran New York for something like a century, with occasional interruptions. And based on apparently on some lectures he gave, uh, he didn't take himself very seriously. There's a lot of sort of making fun of things, but he also gives you a picture of how the system worked, and it was a system that worked pretty well. Uh, so I think on the whole, absolute monarchy was probably a step down, uh, and not a step up. And democracy was probably a step up from absolute monarchy, but we have to wait a while and see how it ends up turning out, because it may turn out pretty badly. Uh, but I don't. I mean, my basic view is that there isn't a good form of government. Uh, the that there may be situations in which a bad form of government is still better than not having a government. That's going to depend on your environment and My view, as I try to make clear in my book, is that a stateless society of the sort I advocate would be stable in some environments, but not in all, that there are circumstances in which it would collapse in one way or another. And if it isn't, then maybe the best you can do is a democracy or a monarchy or feudalism or something. But but that best is not very good. There's a famous quote from Winston Churchill you've probably heard that democracy is the worst form of government ever devised by the mind of man, except for all of the others that have been tried from time to time. And that's usually thought of as a sort of backhanded compliment to democracy. But the alternative is that that implies that there are no good forms of government. That implies that the best form of government is still pretty terrible, which may well have been Churchill's view. Uh, and therefore, you ought to at least look for alternatives to government. And while you have a government, to try to make as large a part of the world not dependent on it, which is basically the libertarian position. Uh,
So, next question. What's a question you are still genuinely unsure about? Something you haven't settled your mind on?
hmm, that's an interesting question. Let me try to think about that. That is, there are a bunch of things that I'm unsure of, but they're not necessarily things that I expect that I could be sure of. The obvious one at the moment is the effect of artificial intelligence. That in my book, Future Imperfect, which was a book that looked at the implications of different technological developments that might happen. And it was written, I suppose, about 10 years ago, maybe a little more than that. Uh, and I discussed artificial intelligence then. It was less lively because it's gotten much better in the last few years. And my comment was that if the AIs turn out to be people, if they turn out to be conscious beings with their own purposes, and if they keep getting smarter, the way computers have kept getting smarter, that in another 20 years, we're gerbils. And we better hope they like pets.
Maybe
And
Ricardo was right along.
maybe,
Ricardo was right all along.
ah, well, no, that was not the problem Ricardo was worrying about. The uh, the implication uh, of Ricardo's point is not that it's not that the AIs will take over, but only that the AIs will make some humans much poorer and some humans much richer, while increasing total wealth. Basically, you work through the logic of it, and that could happen. But the real catastrophic worry, uh, after all, if the result is that we're 100 times richer than we were before, and some people are only 3 times richer, and other people are 1,000 times richer, that's still a pretty good future. Uh, but the worry is that if we don't matter anymore, if there are beings much smarter than we are, smart enough so that they can control us, and maybe they'll decide we're a nuisance and they'd rather not have us around, or whatever, that could be a real danger. And I don't know what the chances of that is. And that's linked to another thing I don't know, which is of maybe even more immediate importance, which is the nature of consciousness. That I have a model of the world, which is basically the conventional sort of physics model of the world. And it explains everything except me. It doesn't explain the term somebody used, I remember who, is the ghost in the machine. That it makes perfect sense to explain people as machines. That they're just artificial intelligences, and they're produced by evolution, just like other animals. Except I'm looking out of my eyes. I know that I'm here. In a sense, the fact that my consciousness exists is one of the facts that I know with greater certainty. because all the other facts are filtered through it. All of the other facts are my sense, my interpretation, my of what my senses tell my body, tell my mind is true, and I don't understand it. And it's important partly for the AI question, for whether the artificial intelligence will really end up being people rather than machines. Uh, if they are, that's very interesting. It means we're going to be sharing the planet with some other people very different from us. But if they keep getting smarter and we don't, it's also scary. Uh, but it's also relevant to lots of other things. I really don't want to die. Well, there have been a whole lot of human uh, views of the world, in which the soul is real and the soul is immortal and it gets reincarnated or goes to heaven or various other things. And that's not the view of the world that I believe in. But I can't be sure that it's wrong because it does. I mean, there's this soul here. I don't know what it is. Uh, so I guess probably the nature of consciousness is maybe the most important unsolved problem from my standpoint, and and it has implications for AI. Although you could imagine AIs that were not conscious and were nonetheless destructive. That's the idea that if you have a very, very smart AI and you set it with some objective, it may turn out that it achieves the objectives in ways that didn't occur to you that involve killing you. Uh,
Going forward to our next question. Um, what's one idea you think most people misunderstand? Even smart and well read people.
Misunderstand. I mean, there are a bunch of ideas that most people don't think about that they have incorrect views on. For example, I was mentioning the idea of feud law, and that most people think of a feud as an unambiguously bad thing, as just going back and forth and back and forth. And in well functioning feud systems, that's not what happens. The feuds terminate fairly quickly, and they it is a mechanism by which people who've harmed other people are forced to compensate them. It doesn't work perfectly. Nothing works perfectly. Uh, Another thing that I suppose most Americans get wrong is that they think that most criminals get a jury trial. And in fact, in America, as it now is, maybe 4% or 5% of people charged with crimes get jury trials. Everybody's got the right to a jury trial. But if you are told by the prosecutor, you've got a choice, uh, I can prosecute you for a really serious crime, and I may not be able to convict you, but I might, or you can plead guilty to a crime with a much smaller penalty. Even if you're not guilty, it may be interested to do it. So that we have a plea bargaining system in the US, which in practice means that most felony verdicts are not being produced by juries, they're being produced by confession. But the confession is done because the alternative is a jury trial, which if you lose will result in a much more unattractive, much higher penalty. Uh, and I've discussed that the in a way it's related, something I discussed in Law's Order, which was somebody else's research, but I thought it was interesting, was the origin of torture in the Middle Ages as as a legal procedure. That what was going on by the account of the person who I read on this, who I knew, uh, was that you had standards of proof which were so rigorous that you in practice couldn't prove most crimes. That basically you can see it in the Jewish law in Maimonides' discussion, where he says that even if you see somebody uh, coming out of a building with a bloody sword in his hand and there's somebody who's been killed inside the building, that's not enough to convict him. That you need to have witnesses. And uh, and the so what happened by his account is that you had a standard of proof that was so high that you couldn't really use it. However, confession could also prove it. That was an alternative way of proving it. It was your 99.9% probability of guilt or confession. Well, confession under torture didn't count, but you could torture somebody and then ask him if he wanted to confess when you stop torturing him. And if he doesn't confess, you'll torture him some more. Uh, and his argument was that they ended up being pushed into doing that, basically that they used to have an alternative solution, which was ordeals, that there were various ways in which you get God to tell you whether somebody was guilty, so that you plunged his hand into boiling water, and if it didn't get injured for a certain length of time, then he was innocent, and if it did, and various variety of other things which we make fun of. And I know a different scholar, an economist, who's argued that the ordeals really worked, and that the reason the ordeals worked was that uh, the people who were being prosecuted believed in them. They believed that God would judge. Therefore, the innocent people chose the ordeal, and the guilty people chose various other legal alternatives that avoided ordeals. The priests knew this, and they therefore rigged the ordeals so that they normally acquitted people unless they had a strong reason to think they were guilty. That's at least trying to remember. Peter Leeson wrote that article. It's a really fun article in a defense of ordeals, and his evidence for it may most two forms of evidence. One of them is that an implausible number of people picked up red hot iron without getting burned, and that the the ordeal where if you floated, where if you floated, you were submerged in water, and if you floated, that meant you were guilty, and if you sank, that meant you were innocent, and then they pull you out. Uh, and if I remember his figures correctly, that was in effect given only to men, because women have subcutaneous fat, which results in a lower body density, and therefore they float. Uh, anyway, it's a neat article by Peter Leeson. I like things like that. Uh, but eventually the church decided that it wasn't legitimate to use ordeals, because that was trying to make God do something, and you aren't supposed to give orders to God. And when the ordeals went, then they ended up with torture. And the argument then is that the American plea bargaining is the same logic, that we set standards for conviction that were so high that if you look at the English legal system in the 18th century, which I've done some work on, uh, they could have like four or five jury trials in a day. Well, the modern American system is more like one trial in 3 weeks. If all of those trials were actually trials, we would be tying up, twice the number of judges we have, and maybe 1 million people, maybe more than that, as jurors. I worked out the numbers at what point. I don't remember them anymore. So therefore, we instead get pushed into this plea bargaining system, which results in a very small number of jury trials, but it does not mean that we actually get the standard of proof we're claiming to have. Anyway, I don't know where that came from, but it's an interesting bit which I discuss in one of the books. Uh, any more questions?
Yeah, I have a long list of questions. I don't think we'll be able to,
Give me
get.
one more.
Okay. So, there is this person on the internet, Liquid Zulu. I don't know if you have heard of him.
Who?
Liquid Zulu.
Ah, yes. I've corresponded with him very briefly. Uh, I read or listened to a good deal of one of his talks about why I'm not an anarchist, and concluded, and I think I discussed that very briefly in the comment thread to one of my Substack posts where somebody had pointed me at him. And I concluded that we just disagree on the definition of anarchist. that what he means by an anarchist is somebody who believes that the that anarchy is morally compelled, that it is morally wrong to have a state, and that's a sufficient reason why you should have anarchy. And what I mean by an anarchist is somebody who believes that a stateless society would be preferable to a society with a state for whatever reason. Uh, and he is certainly correct that I don't present a moral theory. I'm not sure there are very convincing moral theories out there. I have moral beliefs. Everybody does. Uh, but I don't try to argue that the reason you should agree with my political conclusions is because they're morally compelling. I argue that there are reason to think that you would like the society run the way I want to run it better than the alternative ways of running society. So that's not really an argument. He can define anarchist in his way, and by his definition of anarchist, is not an anarchist.
So the way he frames his argument is that he says that the law cannot be on the market because to define the markets, you have to define what is voluntary exchange. And to do that, you have to define that the exchange was not non-aggressive in a way. So you go back to this stolen concept fallacy where you are trying to, steal concepts from the ethical realm to, give a to say that the law can be on market. So what do you think about that?
I think that philosophy, there's a reason why philosophers still read Aristotle and physicists don't, and economists don't either. That is to say, I don't think that you can get very far uh, towards truth by making philosophical arguments. Uh, and I think that we can define voluntary sufficiently well to describe to recognize whether society is that. If people go around hitting each other people on the head, that's probably not a voluntary society. Uh, we have a reasonably good idea of what property rights look like. We don't have a good idea of exactly what they should be, of whether there should be patents and copyrights, and whether what counts as violating it. But we can describe. I mean, after all, we do have a legal system which does do all of these impossible things, uh, and it does it pretty predictably, not perfectly predictably. So I'd have to actually argue with him and look at more detail, but it does not strike me as a very convincing argument. All right, I think we've had the hour that you asked for, and it was fun. And I hope that people other than you listened and enjoyed it. If you end up putting it up on the web, email me so that I can put in a link on my webpage. And if people want to hear more talks by me, if you go on my webpage, there's a link to a page which has got a whole lot of recordings of my talks. And you can
Yeah,
also read
guys.
my books.
You should definitely check out daviddfriedman.com. He has a lot of material there. And also, there is a Substack from Dr. Friedman and a lot of articles. Like, I've been reading like 10, 20 articles from you, like in a week or so. So, yeah, I appreciate that you giving your precious time to us for answering all the questions. I have a long list of questions, but I don't think we will be able
Yeah.
to. Maybe
All right.
sometime later we could
Maybe,
go about.
maybe.
Yeah,
But this was fun, right?
yeah,
Have a good day. Enjoy India. Lots of good food in India. Uh, Lots of smart people. A government that's not quite as bad as it was in the past. Uh, so, bye bye.
bye bye, David.